When I was a teenager, my neighbor built a float plane, so I've always been interested in building a set of floats. Did some research, came up with a set of plans off the internet, and I'm going to see what I can do. I'm going to trace out each one of these frames and create a DXF file for the CNC to cut out. I'm using digitize 2018 and I've selected tracing polylines. Frames are all straight lines, really easy to trace out. Shown here, I also use the text command. I'm going to label each frame just as it is on the diagram. This one's H. There are 8 frames in total, and I'll be tracing out each frame separately. The large notches are 3/4 by 2 inches, and the other notches for the stringers, they're 3/4 by 1/2 inch. And I want those accurate because I want the stringers to fit tight. Again, you can see where I'm using the label command to label each frame. Also note on the notches there where the wood fits into the frame, there's a fillet, and that fillet is glue relief. So when I push that piece of wood into that slot, the glue has a place to squeeze out, makes it nice tight fit. The frames are going to be cut from 1/2 inch plywood. The wood I'm using basswood because I don't want any knots. I want a nice, clean, straight grain. Basswood bends nicely and it's nice to work with. Here I'm using the combination selection for tracing. And those holes in the frames, I would imagine that's to cut down on the weight. When I'm tracing using digitize 2018, I try all the different selections for tracing. And with those round oblong holes in the middle of the frames, the combination selection was the easiest and quickest selection to use. I'll be using nails with a nail gun and screws and a lot of glue to assemble these floats. I usually mention that I use a red pencil to mark off my starting spot, and that's important to me because when I come around to the end of the tracing, I don't want to cause a crossed vector. This way, I stop tracing about 1/8 of an inch away from my starting spot, and I let the computer program close up that vector. Because this tracing is mostly straight lines, there was no editing required. combination selection is great because you've got 4 selections within that selection. You can select line, arc, tracing, or a curve. I also forgot to mention that all my videos and stills, I speed them up between 4 and 8 times just to get through all those video shots quickly. The other thing I like to touch on, if you make a mistake when you're using Logic Trace 2018, just go to Edit, toggle over to that spot where you made the mistake, delete it, and just retrace that area again. Now that I'm almost finished tracing out the frames, I'm going to create 8 DXF files. I'm going to load these files into Vectric Aspire 11.0. I'm going to create a toolpath. Once I'm happy with the toolpath, then I'm going to nest it so I'll get the best cut out of my sheet. Shown here, I've got the sheet of plywood screwed to the slave table of the CNC. I'm using wooden washers to hold that plywood to the CNC table. I had to take some caution when mounting the sheet to the slave table because the CNC is running very close to the edges of the plywood, so I wanted to make sure that the carbide bit didn't run into any screws or nails. The other thing I did here, I did not program any tabbing. As the machine did the first pass, I just put down some finishing nails to hold that piece in place while it's being cut. This actually kept me pretty busy, keeping up with the cuts, pulling nails out, putting nails in. The time passed quickly. The cutting went well, it's just the time it took to do the nailing and then remove the nails. It took about 72 minutes for the whole job. because there's no tabbing, the pieces came out clean. I didn't have to sand that edge where the tab was. Tabs are usually the best way when you're cutting out something, but in this case I would have to sand all those tabs off, so this made the work a lot simpler, but it also caused a lot of work putting those nails in and removing them. Also, to show the cut clarity, I didn't bother using the dust collector. I just used that black hose hooked up to a vacuum cleaner. The nesting here did a really good job. I was able to get those 8 frames cut out of that sheet of plywood and still have enough for 2 7.5-inch cuts for that flat part that's on top the float where you walk on. So all the parts came out of one sheet. You can also see there where I marked on that frame, the frame D. I find sometimes when you cut a bunch of frames that almost look alike, you lose track of which one is which, and then you have to take it back to the diagram, check it out. This way here, I just take a dry marker, mark on each frame as I'm cutting. This is the leftover piece of plywood. Just for a check, I took a few of those frames, put them back onto the paper diagram and checked it. It was fine.